The land did not care what your name was. It did not care where your grandfather was buried, what language he prayed in, or what country had stamped his papers on the way out of a port city he never expected to see again. What the land cared about was whether you could break it, plant it, hold it, and survive the first winter after you had done all three. That was the contract the American Prairie offered to several 100,000 families between 1862 and 1934, and the surnames those families carried onto that ground tell a story that no single history book has ever assembled in full. Some of those names you already know. Some you will recognize as your own, and some of them have a paper trail that when you set it beside the DNA evidence accumulating in genealogical databases right now, produces a gap between what the family claimed to be and what the genome shows. A gap wide enough to hold a generation of deliberate silence. This is the story of the Homestead Act surnames, the families who staked their 160 acres, drove their claim stakes into the sod of Kansas and Nebraska, and the Dakotas and Minnesota and Oklahoma, and became the founding stock of the American mid-continent. And it is the story of what some of those families were told to forget before they ever got there, and what some of them chose to forget once they arrived. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Congress passed the Homestead Act in May of 1862, signed into law by Abraham Lincoln, while a war was being fought to determine who the nation would become. The act was simple in its terms and staggering in its consequences. Any citizen, or any person who declared the intention to become one, could claim 160 acres of federal land by paying an $18 filing fee, living on the claim for 5 years, and making demonstrable improvements to the ground. After 5 years, the land was theirs. After a single generation, a family that had arrived with a trunk and a team of oxen owned ground that would feed their grandchildren. Between 1862 and 1934, when the Taylor Grazing Act effectively closed the era of open federal claims, the government transferred approximately 270 million acres to private citizens under the Homestead Act and related legislation. That is an area larger than France and Germany combined. The families who took that land did not come from one place or carry one kind of name. They came from everywhere the 19th century had made life untenable, and their surnames mapped the full range of what desperation and ambition looked like in the decades following the Civil War. The first surnames on the Prairie were primarily Anglo-American, families whose roots in this country stretched back to the colonial era and who had been moving west one generation at a time since before the Revolution. Names like Harding, Dunbar, Whitfield, and Stoner appear in the earliest Nebraska and Kansas land records from the 1860s, families who knew the mechanics of frontier claim-making because their grandparents had done the same thing in the Ohio River Valley 2 generations before. These were not immigrants learning a new country. These were Americans following a pattern their families had already cut across a continent. Behind them came the Scandinavians. The Norwegian families who began arriving in the upper Midwest in substantial numbers after 1865 settled first in the Minnesota River Valley, then pushed west into the Dakotas and the high plains of Nebraska. The names Olson, Larson, Nelson, and Hansen appear so densely in certain Dakota County land records that genealogists have described the concentration as a continuous band of settlement running through the central Dakotas, which by 1900 contained more people of Norwegian descent per square mile than any comparable region outside Norway itself. What the surname records show, and what the DNA evidence from genetic genealogy databases now confirms, is that these Norwegian families arrived with an unusual degree of shared geographic origin. Studies of upper Midwestern genealogical DNA samples compiled over the past decade find that individuals who trace their ancestry to this settlement band carry a distinctly narrow range of Scandinavian haplogroup markers, a founder effect produced not just by the Prairie's geographic isolation, but by the pattern of chain migration that brought them there. They came from a specific cluster of counties in the Telemark, Rogaland, and Hordaland regions of Norway, not from Norway in general, and the genome of their descendants reflects that specificity in a way that consumer DNA testing now flags as statistically distinct from the broader Scandinavian average. The cousin who stayed in Bergen and the cousin who filed a claim in Codington County, South Dakota in 1883 now carry measurably different genetic signatures because Bergen kept receiving new arrivals and Codington County did not. The Germans came in their own wave, and their story is the one that gets complicated by history in a way the Norwegian one does not. German-speaking immigrants from what are now Germany, Austria, and Switzerland began arriving in the Midwest in serious numbers after the failed revolutions of 1848, and by the time the Homestead Act opened the Prairie, an entire generation of German Americans had already established themselves in Missouri, Illinois, and Wisconsin, ready to send sons and daughters west to file their own claims. Surnames like Schroeder, Hoffman, Mueller, Kessler, Brandt, and Zimmerman fill the deed books of Kansas and Nebraska from the 1870s onward. German was effectively the second language of the Prairie. German-language newspapers circulated in communities from Topeka to Bismarck. German-language church services continued in Lutheran and Catholic parishes well into the 20th century. Then the war came for those names. When the United States entered the First World War in April of 1917, being German in the American Midwest became a liability that some families decided they could no longer afford to carry openly. The pressure was not subtle, and it did not take long to arrive. County school boards across Kansas and Nebraska voted to ban German language instruction, which had been common in communities where the immigrant generation still outnumbered their American-born children. German language churches quietly shifted their services to English, sometimes within weeks of the declaration of war, and German surnames, in a pattern that genealogists have documented in courthouse records from Iowa to Colorado, began to change in land office filings, in deed transfers, in the signature lines of bank loan applications. Mueller became Miller, Schroeder became Sherwood or Schroyer. Hoffman stayed Hoffman in some families and became Huffman in others, a single transposition that put enough distance between a man and his grandfather's country of birth to keep his neighbors from throwing a rock through his storefront window. The 1920 census records in German-settled prairie communities show a pattern of Anglicization so widespread that genealogical researchers examining the German-American record in the 1980s called the period between 1917 and 1920 the Great Renaming. What makes this genealogically consequential is that the renaming was often incomplete in ways that left a traceable record for anyone willing to look. A family might change the surname on a county courthouse deed, but keep the original German form in the family Bible. A woman who married under the anglicized name might receive letters addressed to her maiden name in its original spelling, letters that ended up pressed between the pages of that same Bible and preserved there for a century. The land office records maintained under federal authority sometimes preserved the original filing names even after county records had been updated, creating a sequence where the before and after of the renaming appear in adjacent entries within the same transaction chain. The Czech families left a similar record on the ground just west of the German settlements. Czech immigrants, primarily from the regions of Bohemia and Moravia, arrived in Nebraska in substantial numbers between 1870 and 1890 and claimed ground in a concentrated band running through Saunders, Butler, and Colfax counties, an area that remains identifiable in genealogical records as the Czech Bohemian settlement corridor. Surnames like Novak, Dvorak, Hruza, Kusera, and Blazek appear in the land records of those counties in numbers that reflect the degree to which Czech immigrants settled adjacent to one another, filing claims on neighboring quarter sections and forming communities that maintained Czech-language churches and newspapers well into the 1930s. The DNA evidence from descendants of these Czech prairie settlers shows the same founder effect visible in the Norwegian data. The families who settled that Nebraska corridor came from a geographically narrow range of origin communities in what is now the Czech Republic, and their descendants carry a mitochondrial and Y chromosome signature that genetic genealogists can now use to place an ancestor within a specific Bohemian region, rather than simply within Central Europe in general. The genome has proven, in this case, more geographically precise than the surviving parish records, many of which were damaged or destroyed during the Second World War. The Swedish families came through a different corridor and represent a distinct phase of the same migration pattern. Swedish immigration to the United States peaked between 1867 and 1893, driven by crop failures, land shortage, and a social structure that made it nearly impossible for a landless family to acquire ground in Sweden itself. They settled in Minnesota first, then in Kansas, Nebraska, and Colorado, and their surnames followed them into the land records with a consistency that reflects the chain migration pattern visible across every major homestead ethnic community. One family arrived, found ground, wrote home, and the next family came to claim the adjacent quarter section. What the Swedish land records show, and what makes the Swedish prairie surnames genealogically distinct from the Norwegian ones, is the Anglicization pattern that occurred even without the wartime pressure that transformed German surnames. Swedish surnames were more likely than Norwegian ones to be translated rather than simply respelled. Johansson became Johnson. Lindgren might stay Lindgren or become Linden depending on what the county clerk wrote down on the day the family filed. Eriksson became Eriksson or simply Eriksson depending on the county and the year and the individual clerk's ear for a Swedish vowel. The variation within a single surname cluster can be wide enough that cousins who filed claims in the same township in the 1880s appear in the deed records under 4 different spellings of what was originally one name. The name and the man diverged, in those cases, at the point of the clerk's pen. The homestead claim files hold one more category of surname that the popular history of the prairie has never adequately examined. The land records of Oklahoma, opened to non-Indian settlement in a series of runs beginning in 1889, contain names that reflect what the government called the 5 civilized tribes, and what those tribes themselves understood to be a sovereign status. The runs were designed to strip away. The Dawes rolls, the federal record of tribal citizenship compiled between 1898 and 1914, list the members of the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole nations, with their English names, their traditional names where those were still in use, and the blood quantum figures that determined their allotment rights under the Dawes Act of 1887. The surnames on the Dawes rolls that also appear in the Oklahoma land records of the early 1900s represent families who made a calculation similar to the one the German families would make during the First World War, but with higher stakes and less time. The family that enrolled on the Dawes roll preserved its claim to tribal land allotment, but accepted federal oversight of that allotment. The family that did not enroll, or that enrolled under a diminished blood quantum that understated their actual native ancestry, forfeited tribal standing but gained the ability to move through the surrounding Anglo-American social structure without the legal and social liabilities that came with a documented tribal affiliation in the Oklahoma of 1905. The DNA evidence from families carrying surnames associated with the 5 civilized tribes documents, in some cases, a haplogroup signature that does not match the European surnames those families have carried for 4 or 5 generations. A family named Rogers or Adair or Van, all documented Cherokee surname groups, may carry mitochondrial or Y chromosome markers associated with Native American haplogroups that the official record, if that record only goes back to a post-allotment census, would give no reason to expect. The genome does not know what the family decided to tell the census taker. It only knows where the ancestors were. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The Russian Mennonite families brought a surname pattern to the prairie unlike anything the land office had previously processed. The Mennonites who arrived in Kansas and South Dakota beginning in 1873 were not Russian by ethnic origin. They were the descendants of Dutch and Low German Mennonite families who had accepted Catherine the Great's invitation to settle the Russian steppes in the 1770s, where they were guaranteed exemption from military service and the right to maintain their own schools and churches in their own language. When Alexander II revoked those guarantees in the 1870s, the communities left. Entire Mennonite village communities relocated to the American plains within the span of a single decade, arriving as organized groups rather than as individual families, which meant they could file adjacent claims and recreate, on the Kansas prairie, the village structure they had maintained on the Russian steppe. Names like Friesen, Penner, Dyke, Wiebe, and Wiens appear in Harvey County, Kansas land records from 1873 onward, names that are Low German in form and that had been carried through a full century of Russian residency without significant alteration because the Mennonite communities had maintained their linguistic and social separation from the surrounding Russian population throughout their time on the steppes. The genealogical record of these families is unusually complete by the standards of the era because Mennonite communities kept their own church registers with meticulous care, recording births, baptisms, marriages, and deaths in a tradition that had been continuous since the 16th century. A researcher today can in many cases trace a family line from a Kansas homestead claim backward to a specific village in the Vistula Delta region of what is now Poland, without a single documentary gap. The DNA evidence from Mennonite descendants presents a profile that is unlike any other homestead community, because Mennonite communities maintained strict endogamy, marrying almost exclusively within the faith and often within a network of related families that had been traveling together across 3 centuries and 2 continents. Their genetic signature is among the most demographically isolated of any European-descended American population. Certain genetic conditions associated with low population diversity appear at elevated rates in Mennonite communities, a measurable consequence of the same demographic bottleneck that makes their genealogy so unusually traceable. The surname Friesen in a Mennonite community and the surname Friesen in the broader German-American population can be genealogically separated, in many cases, by a DNA test alone. Then there are the surnames that the official homestead record was not designed to accommodate. African American homesteaders filed claims under the Homestead Act beginning immediately after the Civil War, and in the period following the collapse of Reconstruction, they did so in numbers that the standard account of prairie settlement has consistently underrepresented. The Exodusters, the wave of black migrants who left the former Confederate states for Kansas beginning in 1879, filed claims in Morris, Graham, and Hodgeman counties, among others, establishing communities whose existence the surrounding white settlement often worked actively to obstruct. Nicodemus in Graham County was founded in 1877 and remains the only surviving western black frontier town in the United States. The families who founded it carried surnames that reflect the full range of what surname adoption looked like for people whose legal identity as persons had been restored only a decade before they filed. Some took the surname of a former enslaver, which is documented in the land office files. Others chose names that carried deliberate meaning: freeman, justice, liberty. Names that do not appear in any antebellum slave schedule but that fill the post-war census records and, by the 1880s, the homestead claim files in western Kansas. The DNA evidence for Exoduster descendants documents a genealogical landscape of considerable complexity. The African American population of the Prairie Midwest carries genetic signatures that reflect the full demographic history of the Atlantic slave trade and its aftermath. West African haplogroups that map to specific coastal and interior origin regions, European admixture introduced through a century of coercive contact during the period of enslavement, and in some cases Native American genetic markers that reflect contact between enslaved people and the tribal nations of the Indian Territory adjacent to Kansas, contact the official record of the era rarely preserved in a form that made its way into any filed document. The land records also tell a story about dispossession that the DNA alone cannot tell. County deed books in Kansas from the 1880s show black homestead claims in townships where the surrounding ground was filed by white families, and the land transfer records from the 1890s and early 1900s document a pattern of mortgage foreclosure, claim contest, and outright legal challenge at rates substantially higher than those affecting white homesteaders in the same counties on the same soil. The land left the families within a generation in many cases. The surnames stayed. What did not always stay was the connection between the surname and the specific quarter section that the original filing represented, the 160 acres that was supposed to be the foundation of a family's American story. The surname that the homestead record least expected to appear on the northern plains was the Scandinavian one, attached to a family of mixed Norwegian and Ojibwe ancestry. In the Minnesota land records of the 1870s and 80s, names like Olson and Anderson appear as the legal identifiers of families who, within their own communities, were understood to carry both Norwegian and Native American ancestry. These families filed claims under the Homestead Act as citizens, which required them under the law to present themselves as having severed their tribal connections, because a person enrolled in a tribal nation was not eligible to claim federal land as an individual under the Act's terms. The legal structure forced an identity choice that was designed to have only one permissible answer, and the name those families wrote on the filing form was the Scandinavian one. What consumer DNA testing shows for some families carrying these Scandinavian surnames in northern Minnesota is a genetic signature that contains both Scandinavian haplogroup markers and markers associated with Ojibwe and Cree populations who had inhabited the Great Lakes and northern woodland regions for centuries before Norwegian settlement arrived. The surname in the land records is Scandinavian. The genome carries a record that the land record was specifically structured to exclude. The Irish names on the prairie carry their own complications. Irish immigration to the United States reached its peak in the decade following the Great Famine of the 1840s, and by the time the Homestead Act passed in 1862, an entire generation of Irish-born Americans was positioned to move west. Names like Flanagan, O'Brien, Callahan, Sullivan, and Nolan appear in homestead records across Kansas, Nebraska, and the Dakotas. But Irish homesteading on the prairie was complicated by the same economic circumstance that had driven the original emigration from Ireland: the absence of capital. Filing a claim cost $18. Breaking virgin sod required a team of oxen and a breaking plow, equipment that cost more than a year's wages at the bottom of the urban labor market. Building a sod house required weeks of physical labor before any crop could be planted, and in the first years there was no crop to sell. Many Irish immigrants who arrived during the famine wave never accumulated the resources to file a homestead claim and remained in the wage economy of the eastern cities for the rest of their lives. The Irish who did reach the prairie in numbers tended to be from the second generation, American-born children of immigrants who had spent a decade accumulating the tools and the money to go west. Their surnames appear in the land records of the 1870s and 80s. a decade behind the Anglo-American families who arrived in the 1860s, for reasons that have nothing to do with ambition and everything to do with arithmetic. The land records also document a category of claimant that the Act had not been drafted with in mind as primary, women filing on their own behalf. Single women, widows, and women who had been abandoned were legally eligible to file homestead claims as heads of household if they met the citizenship requirements, and thousands across the Prairie states did exactly that. A woman named Maddie Oblinger, whose letters to her family in Indiana have been preserved and published, filed a claim in Fillmore County, Nebraska in the late 1870s and recorded in those letters the daily arithmetic of survival on the claim, the cost of seed corn, the weight of sod bricks, the calculation of whether the crop would cover the mortgage payment due at the bank in Beatrice. The surname on her claim is her husband's name. The voice in the letters is entirely hers. What the DNA evidence makes plain about these Prairie families, read together, is that the founder effect the homestead communities produced was real and is still measurable, though it was never as extreme as the founder effect documented in the Appalachian communities that settled a century before. The Prairie was never as geographically sealed as a mountain cove. Railroads ran through the homestead counties within years of initial settlement. Market towns grew at railroad junctions within a generation of first claims. The insularity of communities like the Norwegian belt in the Dakotas or the Czech Bohemian settlements in Nebraska was cultural and linguistic rather than geographic, and it began dissolving by the second generation as English-language schools drew children of every origin into a shared civic life. But the founder effect is measurable. Consumer DNA testing has identified genetic communities corresponding to Scandinavian Prairie settlement, to German-Russian Mennonite ancestry, and to the Czech Bohemian settlement corridor that are statistically distinct from the broader populations those communities drew from. A descendant of Norwegian belt settlers in the Dakotas may carry a genetic signature that places their deep ancestry in a narrower range of Norwegian origin communities than a random sampling of modern Norwegian DNA would produce, precisely because the founding families came from a specific geographic cluster and then married primarily within their settlement network for 2 or 3 generations before broader outmarriage began to blur the signal. The surname that survived the Prairie intact, in all the forms it arrived in, tells you where to look. The surname that changed between 1917 and 1920 tells you what the family was afraid of. The surname that appears in a homestead claim under one spelling and in a church record under another tells you that the family made a deliberate calculation about which documents would be read by strangers and which ones would only ever be read by people who already knew the truth. A Mueller who became a Miller in 1918 may have a grandchild today who tests as substantially German in ancestry and cannot find the original filing name in any federal land record because every search has been run under the wrong spelling. A Johansson who became a Johnson in the 1890s may have descendants who know they carry Scandinavian ancestry without knowing which country or which county within that country, because the chain migration detail that would answer the question was attached to the original surname, and the original surname was set aside. The land record and the DNA record, read against each other, can close that distance. The National Archives holds the original homestead claim files, which in many cases contain biographical detail that the census records of the same period do not preserve. The claimant's country of origin, their date of arrival in the United States, the names of the witnesses who attested to their 5-year residency on the claim, and in some cases a physical description of the claimant at the time of filing. The Bureau of Land Management's General Land Office Records database has digitized a portion of these files and made the original land patents searchable by name. The spelling variants in that database reflect the original filing, before Anglicization, before the war, before whatever the family decided to carry forward and whatever they chose to leave behind. The genome you carry right now contains a record the family did not always keep. That 3 or 5 or 7% of Scandinavian ancestry in a DNA result from a family that has called itself German for 100 years may be the trace of a marriage between a Norwegian claim filer and a German neighbor in a Nebraska township in 1884, a union nobody thought to write down because it seemed too ordinary at the time. The Mennonite genetic cluster that appears in a result from a family whose surname is otherwise unremarkably Anglo-American may be the trace of a great-grandmother who left her community when she married, and whose origins were absorbed into her husband's surname within a single generation, carried forward in the genome long after they were lost to the name. The Prairie was not a melting pot in the sense that phrase usually implies, a uniform mixture in which individual origins dissolve into something undifferentiated. It was a place where origins were maintained privately and presented publicly as something more legible to the institutions that controlled access to land, to credit, and to civic standing. The family that filed under one name and prayed under another, that taught its children English at school and German or Norwegian or Czech at the dinner table, that registered its land under the anglicized form of its surname and wrote the original form on the inside cover of a Bible, did not lose its origins. It stored them where the census taker could not see them, where only the genome and the oldest documents in the deepest county archive still hold what was put there. What you are looking at, when you trace a homestead claim back to its original filing, is the moment before that storage happened. The moment when the family stood at the land office counter with their $18 and their intention to become something the law would recognize, and wrote down a name that would be recorded in a federal document and attached to a piece of the American continent. What they wrote is still there, in the land patent, in the original entry file, in the county deed book where the first transfer was recorded. And what the genome shows, 3 and 4 and 5 generations later, is whether that name was the whole story or only the part of it the land required them to tell. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.